Hi, it's Dr. Nadine Rosechild-Sullivan, and we're speaking tonight again about social stratification by race. And so I want to pick up where we left off. We were talking about things that led into the criminal justice system last time, but I want to talk tonight about social stratification in regard to home ownership and land ownership. So at the end of the Civil War, as African Americans are freed, you've basically cut loose with nothing. And so in that moment of time when African Americans are simply cut loose, there is a general Sherman who makes a statement about 40 acres and giving every African American 40 acres, which would have been some form of reparations and at least a chance at an ability to build a life, because even though we currently live in a situation in which we're not most of us farming, we're not most of us growing or producing our own food. It is actually the land from which all resources come, and it's the land from which all wealth is ultimately built. But so Lincoln did agree, then he's assassinated, and his successor, Andrew Johnson, did not follow through but rescinded the order, and so African Americans were not given anything to build with, to build their lives with, as they moved forward after the war. Also at that point in time, Indians had been removed from the territories in the West and placed onto reservations, and white citizens are being offered free land. If you come west and you settle it, there's the Oklahoma land rush, there's the Oregon Trail, there's all sorts of white people moving into Indian lands, taking them over and getting them for free, simply for squatting on them, for inhabiting them, for building property on them. They become the settlers that take over those spaces. But this is an enormous amount of land given for free, and resources and the opportunity to build wealth for oneself based in that space. African Americans had been laboring and building wealth, but they hadn't been allowed to do it for themselves by and large. So we get into that space. We talked last time also about Reconstruction and the end of Reconstruction. So there is, from the end of the Civil War, and for free Blacks before that, but for the majority of African Americans who had been enslaved and were now liberated and able to begin to build wealth, Black people began to build not only their own homes, but cities and towns and Black businesses and thriving centers, and to really build communities. And this began to happen almost immediately during Reconstruction. It continues after Reconstruction. And what then happens is there is this horrific history of what is, in a way of making it sound less than it is, called ethnic cleansing. And so literally in the decades that follow, in the end of the 1800s and the early 1900s, literally 1/3 of the land mass of the United States had communities of color, largely African American, removed or were ethnically cleansed. So so let me talk a little bit about that. So lynching would often be, when we talked about lynching last time, lynching would also be a trigger that would set off the beginning of an ethnic cleansing. So you'd have an African American community that was beginning to build itself and to thrive. And if it's in the South and in places where Jim Crow laws have gone into effect, then it's a very, very segregated community. And so there's very often poor white people over here looking at the African Americans who are beginning to thrive, and there's some levels of jealousy in all of that. But also in that space, then there's this we talked about how lynching averaged about 150 a year in the United States through those decades. And there would often be the accusation of a white woman that a Black man had done something inappropriate in some way. Sometimes they were accusations of rape, and other times they were accusations of, we talked about Emmett Till last time, of having whistled at her or looked at her crooked, or what. So it was very, very touchy, whatever would set this off, this seething, wanting back what used to be that the white people were into, or the sense. And we talked a little about how sometimes elites use race as a way to divide and conquer, and kind of pacify and mollify poorer or working class whites with the idea that, well, at least you're white, at least you're not in one of these other racial or ethnic groups. And so that very fragile sense of entitlement can be very easily aggrieved. And so the just very touchy situations. And so there are many more than what I've written down here, but in 1864 in Washington County, Indiana, there was an ethnic cleansing, or what actually that means is that Black people would be murdered and driven out of their communities, driven off of their land, right? So when we're saying that a piece of land or an area, a region, a town, a county is being ethnically cleansed, quote, air quotes around that again, it is being, what's happening is the people who are living there are being driven off in one way or another. 1885, Comanche County, Texas. 1902, Pierce City, Missouri. 1905, Harrison, Arkansas. 1912, Forsyth County, Georgia. 1921, Tulsa, Oklahoma. 1923, Rosewood, Florida. Time after time after time. And so these are some of the incidences of which I am aware, but there are countless more. If you're doing this to a third of the landmass of the United States, north, south, east, and west, you're doing it to a whole lot of places. And so what would actually happen? The movie Rosewood actually does a relatively good job for a Hollywood film of depicting what actually happened in Rosewood, Florida in 1923. And basically what does happen is that there is an accusation by a white woman that a Black man assaulted her, beat her. In the film, that's depicted as she's not claiming rape, but other people are going there with it. But and in the film, it's depicted as her having an affair on her husband with a man who was abusive and who beats her, and she's covering for herself and for that situation. But however the facts of that actually played out in Rosewood, what did play out in Rosewood is that then there begins to be lynching after lynching after lynching as a white mob, extrajudicial killing, we talked about that last time too, as a white mob goes out and begins to say, this guy knows who did it, or that guy knows it, we will torture you until you tell us who did it, and then one way or the other will end up hanging you from a tree. So the lynchings expand in Rosewood until there's a moment in time when the white male community lines up with their rifles and lines up shoulder to shoulder and marches through the Black community, just firing upon house after house, setting houses on fire. And so people who haven't been lynched already are shot, and many others manage to make it into the woods, into Florida, I guess it's swamps, but they make it into the wild out there with children, and then they're running from the mobs, and they're running from men with rifles, and they're running from dogs. And there were a number of survivors of Rosewood, Florida. And so with these others in Tulsa, Oklahoma, there was an area that had become known as Black Wall Street. It was so amazingly successful. And then there's a story about a white woman gets on an elevator. There's a Black man on the elevator. I don't recall off the top of my head if he was hired to operate the elevator, because people used to do that, or if he was simply on the elevator. But she says something when she gets off the elevator, and it goes up like a tinder box, and they literally again burn that section of Tulsa, Oklahoma to the ground in 1921. And with it, there's all this Black wealth and all this Black labor that is lost to themselves as a community there in that space. There are survivors of the Black Wall Street massacre you can find footage on YouTube. If you put that in the search engine for Black Wall Street, you will find some people who were like 102 when they're being interviewed 10 years ago or whatever, but they were children, and they were old enough children to remember what was happening and to be aware. And some of them even thought that there were airplanes flown over, that there were military things flown over, and that there were bombs dropping from above. But just this something that happens. What happens with all of that there's a number of things. One is these areas that have been, air quotes again, ethnically cleansed. These areas are then designated as sundown towns or counties. And what it meant, if a place was a sundown town, it was, if you're Black, don't let the sun, go down when you find you still here in this town. So you could come to this area to work. You could be hired by the white people who lived in that town or county to clean their houses or work in their fields or do whatever other things, work on their cars. But it was, when the sun went down, you had no business being there because no one Black was allowed to live there anymore. And so there's this something that is then set into place in all of these areas. But if we're moving back to the idea of social stratification on the grounds of race and land and home ownership, let's think about what that actually means to us as an inheritance. So a lot of this is approximately 100 years ago, leading into the 1930s. Some of it we're not quite 100 years out from. But if you think about what are the long-term effects of that on people of various racial and ethnic groups in the United States. So one of the things is that many, many white people, families, communities, and still are benefiting today from areas that were taken from the Native Americans at that point in time. So that white land rush to the west, right? Of course, even sitting here in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, this land was inhabited by the Lenni Lenape people for 18,000 years. The fossil record demonstrates that. The tribe maintains that, but there are specific kinds of arrowheads that have been used by their people, and they've been found down in the layers of rock in the Philadelphia, Delaware, Jersey area, all up and down the Susquehanna River Valley, that are, that clearly designate that the inhabitants of this region were those inhabitants for thousands and thousands of years, and they were clearly removed. And so even tonight, I am in my Western privilege, benefiting from land that by rights what does not belong to me. We know for a fact that the Lenape people here in this region of South Jersey and southeastern Pennsylvania and Delaware, we know that they were given blankets that had been taken off of soldiers with smallpox, folded up without being laundered, and given to the tribe in order, with the intention of creating an epidemic that then did kill many of them and make clear this land, a different form of ethnic cleansing instead of at rifle fire at the level of germ warfare. We know also that that was done to the Plains tribes at the end of the air quotes Indian Wars, as the genocide was being completed out in the late 1800s and the last decades of the 1800s in the Plains states, and as the Lakota and the other tribes of those regions were being, who had been resistant, were being captured and forced onto reservations. In that time space also, they were intentionally given blankets with smallpox, and then smallpox would sweep through the tribe because it was a novel virus to them. They had no resistance, and in ways that white people and African peoples did have some resistance to smallpox because we had been domesticating farm animals for millennia, both in Africa and in Europe. And whereas the indigenous peoples of the Americas had no domesticatable farm animals, there were some llamas, and you can't do much with a bear, you can't do much with a mountain lion. So there really weren't those kinds of, they didn't have those animals, even horses. We think of the native peoples in regard to horses, but they were brought by the Spanish. So there's that whole, they did not have resistances. So there's that kind of ethnic cleansing and that kind of, that forced removal from the land. But what's happening here to Black neighborhoods, and also I want to add, there were more than 200 Chinese American communities who were also removed from their land in these kinds of ways. And briefly, let me stop at the Japanese internment during World War II, when Japanese Americans, born American citizens, and sometimes the generation before them who were those who had immigrated, but even the children born here and some of whom were quite, were not babies anymore, but Japanese Americans and both citizens and immigrants were taken and put into concentration camps, removed largely from California because of patterns of migration in regard to the Japanese at those prior to World War II, but designated as, George Takei talks about it in his video, Why I Love a Country That Betrayed Me. And he talks about, his memory of being 4 or 5 years old, whatever he was, in the internment camps, and what it was to go to the bathroom in the middle of the night, to the latrine with guards in the gun towers with their training their spotlights on him and their rifles on him, and but his family and all of those families, they were given simply hours of notice, had to pack a bag, take their stuff, take what they could carry, get on the trains, be transported to concentration camps. They then spent a number of years in the concentration camps, and when they were eventually, quote, liberated and set free of that and went back to where they had been, San Francisco or wherever, went back home, white people, other people had moved into their homes and their businesses, not either knocked their building down and put up another one, or just were simply inhabiting their business and their house, and their stuff, the possessions they couldn't carry. People had taken them and dispersed them and sold them and used them. It was like, hey, flea market, estate sale, I got a house full of furnishings. I like this, I don't like that, you take it. And so when they came back, there was no place for them to go back to. There was no open door back. Again, with the Jews in the Holocaust in Germany, when they were transported to camps, when those who survived the camps and then went back to their cities and homes of origin, other people were living in them, and there was no giving it back. And so this way of theft. But when it comes to, let's go back to African Americans again for the moment. So this particular form of racial violence that happens, not only is there the violence to the people of the moment, but think about what happens to their descendants. So what happens then is this land has been taken, you don't get it back. So, even if you think of, hypothetically, there are people alive today who are boomers who had this would have been their great-grandparent, and they may have known their great-grandparents, and these grandparents and great-grandparents of people alive today were those who had owned that piece of property, who had at least been children on that piece of property, and whose family owned it, and it was no longer theirs. It was no longer in the family's possession. And if you think about, so not every family always keeps their property anymore, but even if I have a piece of property and I sell it, when I die, I don't take it with me. I don't know if I said this in the last video or not, but I've got issues with that "he who dies with the most toys wins" bumper sticker, because he who dies with the most toys leaves it to his no good nephew 4 generations later. I mean, you don't get to take it with you. You go, there was St. Francis of Assisi. I grew up Catholic. St. Francis of Assisi is reputed to have stripped naked as he was dying, saying something about having come into the world naked and leaving it the way he came in. You go naked into the afterlife, assuming that there is one. I do, you may not, but whatever, you leave everything behind, and it goes to your family. And often that's a good thing. And so, not if you've got a no good nephew, but if you've got children and grandchildren and people you love, and you want to build wealth, from family through generation to generation, you want that something. And so there is, that's not happening for African Americans. So think about what happens. So if I've been forced off of property, I'm African American, I've been forced off of property somewhere, there's nowhere in the United States with our justice system as it would have been in the 1910s 1910s, 1920s, 1930s, there's nowhere to go and get a redress of grievances. You can't, whether, if you took the deed to your land as you fled into the woods in the night with your babies trying to not get shot, then if you took that deed, there was no court you could take it to, and in all likelihood it burned up in the house, you know. And so, but there's no way to redress those grievances. If by the time the civil rights movement is coming more into play, if there might have been a way to have other courts address it, if you could have been something, it's all so long ago, it becomes water under the bridge. There becomes no real way to address this. And so there's also the domestic terrorism of the Klan in those times. So if you think you can go to court as a Black person and say, hey, my grandfather owned that piece of land, and that white man living on it now in that nice house, you know, that actually, he knocked my house down and built that one, or he built mine up, or that was my really nice house and he's still in my house. Whatever that looks like, there's no way to do that, because if you did do it and could have gotten a court to listen to you, if you had the money to do that, and the whatever abilities to do that, if the justice system would have listened to you, the Klan was going to come and get you in the middle of the night. There was simply absolutely no way through into the 1970s, maybe. And so with that, what happens is, so having recommended Rosewood with a trigger warning, let me recommend without a trigger warning for images of abject violence. Let me recommend a documentary film called Banished. And in Banished, it designates, it goes back to Forsyth County, Georgia, and Harrison, Arkansas, and a couple of these sites. And the family members, the surviving family members, the descendants down the line, go back to these places and they begin to research what happened to their family 2 or 3 generations back, and they're researching, and they have family stories about what happened, and they're looking in the documents, and they're looking in the public records, and they're looking at the land that would have been theirs. And Forsyth County, Georgia, if I remember correctly, it might be suburban Atlanta, but it's some pretty nice, the property is, you know, there were acres and acres, and the houses on them are gorgeous. And so they're looking at what happened. And what happens is you go back in the deeds, because when you buy a property, your deed has to, you know, go through this process to make sure that it's free to be sold to you. And what happened in the chain of deeds for these properties was that there was, whether there had been 2 or 3 owners or whatever since that time, or 1 owner since that time, there's a moment in time when there is no deed. The Black family that owned it has been driven out. The white squatters have taken it over. Everybody's got social permission in the white community to do this. And so the white people begin, okay, that's your house and that's your land and those are your property lines. We're good with that. And so what happens is that person just gets to squat there. But if they went to sell it, they would go to court and file something called a deed of adverse possession, where a judge would declare that they'd been squatting there for, 10, 20, 30 years or whatever, and that they therefore, and something had happened to that other deed, oh gosh, who knows what. And so, no problem there. And so, yes, you may now sell your property to the next guy. And so there's this break in those deed chains, but there's again, how do you address that when the people living in that house, living on that land or that property, have been working it for decades, have been paying mortgages, or doing there's no redress of these grievances. But what it has meant is that where white families could, and some of us have very poor white families, but where some white families could lay up some wealth and pass it down through the generations, Black families have not been able to do that in the same way. And so one of the biggest statistics of the difference between white and Black wealth in the United States is based on home ownership, right? And so there's that. I want to talk also for a moment then about the mid-20th century. So we leave that era and we go from the Depression into World War II. And what begins to happen in World War II is that afterwards, the returning veterans, the government wants to try, the federal government has this idea, it needs to rebuild. They've just been through this 10-year depression that was like people were starving depression. And then they've been through this war that has taken everything, and people have been living with rations, and everything had to go into making munitions, and all of the money's been being spent on military, things, fighting the war in Europe and fighting the war in the Pacific. And so the government wants to do things to rebuild the housing market, and they want to build the automobile industry. So at this moment in time in America, many people don't have cars. Cars are mostly for the elite, and most people are taking public transportation. The government would like to change that. It would like people to purchase cars, and it would like people to be purchasing new houses. And so it's trying to think of how to do that. Now, meanwhile, because of patterns of forced migration in the United States, we can see our ethnic racial makeups are based on patterns of immigration. And because overwhelmingly Black people were brought to the eastern coast of the United States and the southern part of the United States as part of this slave system, at 1900, 90% of the African American population is south of the Mason-Dixon line. By 1950, that has shifted, and 90% of the African American population is north of the Mason-Dixon line in urban cities, in Philadelphia, in Camden, in New York, in Chicago, in major urban areas, right? And so there's been this great migration of Black Americans from one location to another. And there are any number of reasons for that going on. There is, of course, the ongoing racism in the South, the ongoing structural Jim Crow racism, the segregation in the South. There is also, because it's not like we weren't racist in the North, but there's also, there are some opportunities opening up. Black people had been kept out of unions for a while, but were getting into unions, and there were more industrial jobs, and there was the opportunity to make a better living. And because of the American labor movement, some of those industrial jobs actually then had a living wage. Healthcare benefits were being attached to wages as World War II was coming to an end. And so people are getting benefits and pension plans and a couple of weeks pay. The labor movement had fought for a 40-hour work week, had fought for child labor to end, had fought for, just a series of benefits that were not true in rural farming jobs. And so Black people are pressing north to get into factories and to get into industries and to get into cities. If you look through Camden, if you look around Philadelphia, you can see the remnants, the remains of those factories. And that's a whole other conversation of how the manufacturing left the cities and went elsewhere. But at this window in time, that's vibrant manufacturing. And so there are a number of things that happen to home ownership at this point in time. And I'm going to read something for a minute too. One of the things that we do sometimes hear about is that white families would make racial covenants with their neighbors, so that within a neighborhood, people would sign contracts with their neighbors not to sell. White people were doing this, not to sell their house to Black people who were moving into the cities. And they were thinking, overwhelmingly, the white people of that generation who were old enough to be homeowning at that point in time, they were thinking that it was the fact that a Black family moved in that brought their housing values down. And so they were signing covenants with their neighbors not to allow that to happen because they were worried about losing money on their houses. But something else is actually going on. So I want to talk about actual redlining, because there is individual level prejudice and bigotry and discrimination, but there's also systemic, institutionalized racism. And so there's a huge part played in this that is not just the individual, but that is the structure, the system. So I want to talk about redlining, and I want to read a piece. Now, this is from the Rick Burns American Experience documentary called New York. And I think it started out to be an 8-episode series. They might have added an episode 9 after the World Trade Towers were hit. But anyway, the year I have for it is 2004, American Experience, New York, episode 6. This episode is called City of Tomorrow, and it begins at minute 124 and goes to minute 128. And these are the words of, first I'm going to read, a narrator said, the federal mortgage and loan programs in order to revive the moribund housing market set in motion a fateful process which would systematically segregate neighborhood after neighborhood in inner cities by race. And then the next words are from historian Craig Stephen Wilder, who is speaking in this documentary. So this is from him. He said, African-American ghettoization really begins in the third decade of the 20th century. It begins in the 1930s. It begins with New Deal policy because Blacks were being excluded from New Deal policy. In the decades since they've been included, the New Deal policies do us all a lot of good. Social Security, unemployment insurance, we pay into that's another story. But it begins with the New Deal policy because it was initially set up in this racialized fashion. And now back to Craig Stephen Wilder. It begins with the federal government and the state governments colluding with banks and insurance companies to solve New Deal problems by building housing at the periphery of the city. And in order to create a market for that housing, you've got to force white working class and middle class families to move. White families were recent immigrants by and large, you know, Italians and Jews and Polish people. They were relatively new immigrants. They were in ethnic neighborhoods in cities and they had connections there. So you've got to force them to move. And said, and in order to get them out there, what we actually do is to make it irrational to stay inside the city. It becomes economically irrational to stay in the city. That was me. During the early years of the New Deal, the federal government established the Homeowners Loan Corporation. And the Homeowners Loan Corporation actually went out and it began mapping out the cities into neighborhoods, going block by block and finding every Black, Latino, Irish, Jewish, Italian, Polish family that there was, and assigning ratings to each neighborhood based on the racial and ethnic makeup. Then they distributed the maps to banks and held banks to a certain standard when loaning money for homes and rental. The consequences of having your ratings go down is, of course, that your housing property goes down. The value of houses was actually dropping before anybody's moving in. It's dropping based on this mapping that's going on. All of a sudden, your house is less valuable, not because you've done anything and not because your neighborhood has changed, but because banks won't lend anyone money to move there unless those people are Black. So if a block has been designated Black, then that's it. And so the housing prices have dropped and you can't sell your house for what you thought it was worth. After the federal level of this, from the Homeowners Loan Corporation, the state also, and he's specifically talking about New York State at this point, but I presume this was true for other states. The state also gets involved in redlining. They also map out the city block by block, and this time they look for only Black and Latino, and a single Black person living on a block is enough to redline a block. The effect was that Black families that had been scattered throughout New York City were being physically segregated, rooted up. In 1930, Black Brooklynites were actually the least segregated group physically. By 1950, they're the most segregated group. Harlem goes from being an ethnic community with quite a bit of mobility and optimism to a racial slum with very little optimism, very little hope. The federal government had armed banks and insurance companies and real estate dealers with the public authority to keep Black people inside that physical space and to force new migrants to the city inside similar physical spaces. So Black communities no longer control their own destiny by the 1950s and 60s. They're being forced and physically quarantined inside the cities at a time when white Americans are peculiarly mobile. So white Americans are being enticed out to the suburbs, and we'll talk more about that in a moment. They're being given economic deals that would make it insane not to take them at the same point that Black families are being quarantined, or being forced into physically segregated space. There's also a way in which, especially I know of in Philadelphia, they shut down public transportation at the borders of the city so that, you know, the bus does run to the suburbs, but There's a bus that runs by me every 10 minutes. There's a bus that runs to the suburbs every 2 hours. So they're being, you know, physically quarantined. And so this is the quote from him that has resonated with me ever since I initially saw this film, probably in 2004. And he then says, so historian Craig Stephen Wilder says, why is there a Black ghetto in every city in the United States? And he said, the answer is public policy. The way we remap cities racially in order to solve economic crises. So what's happening there is there's a number of factors going on. So the veterans have returned from World War II. The government wants to fund housing and the automobile industry. The federal government passes a federal highway program, and the federal government also, so they build the highways, they build the interstates, they make it possible, and they begin to build the suburbs, right? And so they make it possible to live in the suburbs and still go back to work in the city. They want the white family to move to the suburbs and to buy a car, and the daddy to go back and forth every day, because at that moment in time, white women are pretty much encapsulated with domesticated animals kept inside our homes and installed every bit as much as the refrigerator and the oven and the washer dryer. But so there's this image of that 1950s white family in the suburbs, and the stay-at-home wife and mother, and the father that, you know, motors off every morning and motors back every evening. And so to accomplish this goal, they passed the Federal Highway Act, and they're building these roads. They also do this redlining. So they do redlining, and they also pass, there's VA housing loans for veterans, and there are Federal Housing Authority loans, FHA housing loans, with ridiculously low interest rates. And with those houses and those interest rates, they make it so that if you're white, the cost of your mortgage in the suburbs your interest rate is going to be so low and your monthly payments so low that your rent in South Philly's Italian neighborhood is higher than your rent is going to be out in, you know, in Lower Bucks County. And so you buy a house and you watch them build it, and you pick from 3 models, and you choose which kind of wall oven you want. And you go and you buy a car, and you excitedly visit and watch the stick frame house being built. And then, you know, 6 months or whatever later, you get to move into your new house every morning. Daddy gets back in the car and goes back into the city to his job and comes home, and the actual housing costs are cheaper for that white family than they would have been if they had determinedly stayed in their tiny apartment near their extended family in their ethnic neighborhood. So that is happening there. But that has huge implications, right? The way the federal government wrote, so the the way it wrote the Federal Housing Administration loan materials were clearly, this is prior to the Civil Rights Movement, they're clearly racially coded, and there's overt, not covert, there's forthright racism in the documents. And they, with their redlining, they also command the mortgage lenders and the real estate brokers and and the insurance companies, you may only do this according to these ways. And so you could only have an FHA housing loan if you got it, because if you were a white and you were getting it for a single family home in the suburbs, you couldn't have it for an apartment building in the suburbs. You couldn't get one for, even if you were white, you couldn't get one for a house in the city. Also at the same time, they put a third program into place, which was alternately called the Slum Clearance / Urban Renewal Program. And they began to, with their redlining, also designate certain buildings, blocks, neighborhoods as slums, and then knock those down. One of the way Donald Trump's father, Fred Trump made some of his money was he was one of those real estate developers in New York City. So you could in many cities, you're a real estate person, you're a contractor of some sort, and so you make a bid to the federal government, you turn in your proposal and you're bidding with other people, and if you win that contract, then you were given certain blocks of Manhattan or Chicago or Philadelphia or whatever. You're given these blocks of city, and what you have to do is you have to knock down everything that's there: historic churches, historic homes, whatever's the pretty houses, not pretty houses, whatever's there. It's all been, they took a red wax crayon-y pencil-y thing called that they used to have. You tore edges off and revealed you didn't sharpen it. Anyway, they would take that marker and they would redline the map, and you got the contract and you knocked down the properties that were there, and you were supposed to haul away the rubble. Sometimes they didn't do a really good job of that, but you were supposed to haul away the rubble, and then you were supposed to build affordable housing for people. You were getting rid of the slum housing and going to make new housing, but you didn't have to. You now owned that section of Manhattan. It was yours. You did the work, and now you owned it, and now you got to choose what you put up. So you could put up housing for the wealthy, you could put up an art museum, you could put up a stadium, you could put up whatever it was that you wanted. And so those developers then built things that were to their financial and economic benefit, and perhaps to some city planners' idea of what would be nice for the city as well. But in all of that, in that window of time, 90% of the affordable housing in urban cities in the United States was destroyed in the name of slum clearance and urban renewal. So what happens then to cities is that largely, so our tax base is based on home ownership. School districts and townships are funded out in the suburbs by your homeowners, by your property taxes. In the city, by destroying so many of the owned homes and leaving only rental units, most of the people in the city, most of the people then coming in, you've also designated, you've got this migration of Blacks from the South who have been kept poor because they've been living under Jim Crow. Some of them have been sharecropping or working fields, and so they're coming north to become middle class, to press into the middle class, to press at least into the lower middle class through a factory job. But in that process, you're bringing in people who don't currently have wealth, and they're becoming renters, not homeowners within the city. And so cities begin to go bankrupt around the country with this shift in population as well. So all of this is happening at that window in time. In 1968, there is a Federal Housing Act passed, but it has absolutely no teeth, no way, no mechanism by which you could enforce it until 1988. And then even since then, so it may seem to you that it's been a long time since 1988. Doesn't seem like that to me, but if it seems like that to you, still think about the fact that today, right now, if we do a sociological research study and we take a white and a Black individual or a white and Black family, and we give them exactly the same credit rating and work histories on documentation and send them in to apply for mortgages or to try to rent or to buy or whatever, when we do those kind of studies and send people in, we get very different results. And if the Black individual or family does get to purchase the home or rent the apartment, the cost is higher, the interest rate is higher, the monthly payment is higher. So overwhelmingly, there are ongoing ways in which housing discrimination can be carried out without it really showing. And the way our civil rights laws are, if you're discriminated against, you have to have the money to go hire the lawyer and to go fight the case and to file with the Equal Employment Opportunities Commission or the whatever kind of civil rights organization, federal or state or national, that you're going for. You have to be able to do that, and you have to be able to pursue that, and you have to have the resources to get that all the way through to the end in order to prove that you've been discriminated against. And you have to be able to prove their intent, which becomes very iffy because, you know, they've practiced being careful about not saying the wrong thing. Is they just go, I'm sorry, that apartment's, oh, we rented it this morning. Or that house, I'm sorry, we sold that house. And so there's all of that. Or yes, you can have the house, but, you know, it costs a couple thousand more than it would have the other way. So there are those things. So all of that brings us to where we are now. The fact that the Fair Housing Act is not enforceable through until '88, the fact that it's still built on being able to prove someone else's intent to discriminate against you, the fact that white families, those that were middle class, were able to build some wealth and leave it to their children and their grandchildren. We need to recognize that this was an enormous affirmative action program for white people. It built the middle class. In very real measure, there were two classes in American society, two socioeconomic classes, as we come up through the early years and up into the 1920s, as we approach the Great Depression. There are the very wealthy and there are working class people. And that's what's there. There is no middle class in American society, not the way we know it or have known it these past decades. There's no real middle class. What happens with the New Deal policies in the Depression is they are initially raced in that so Social Security is set up and unemployment insurance is set up, but you cannot access them at that point in time if you are a domestic worker, which that was the job available for most Black women in that, like the overwhelming number, statistically, population-wise, in those windows of time was to get a job cleaning a white woman's house or raising a white woman's children. If you didn't yet have a factory job would often be, you know, would be better. And then it also those weren't applicable if you were a farm worker of some kind, right? So if you were sharecropping, if your grandparents or great-grandparents, whichever generation it would have been, had been freed from slavery but had stayed in the region because it's where all their connections were and all their people were, and had then worked for the former slave master on his plantation for some pittance of money, but, you know, enough to get by or whatever, so sharecropping had gone in as a system to make up also for the lack of workers. And so if you were doing that until you came north, as you're, you know, as in all of that window of time, as the New Deal comes in, you're not paying unemployment insurance, you're not paying Social Security insurance. If you work over the table, you know that you pay it in every paycheck now. My father was fond of saying, these are not entitlements. These are, I've paid into this all of my working life. This is an insurance. I was told I would have this insurance. I was told Medicare would be there. I was told, you know, some monthly Social Security payment would be there for me. And I was also told that if I were laid off, that I would have, on average, 6 months in the history of unemployment. Sometimes they've extended it longer. They extended it longer in the financial crash of 2007, 8, and 9. It was not a one-year crash. It began under George W. Bush's presidency, and it was already in motion. And the bank bailout was already written by George W. Obama signed it. We all suffered. People lost houses, people lost jobs, people lost $20,000 a year of income and went from doing one job to doing 3 for $20,000 less. There was a lot going on in 2007, 8, and 9, and maybe even 10. Economically, the average salary in the United States the household income has still not recovered from that before this hit, from the pandemic and whatever this means for us all economically going forward. But, you know, those come in the 30s. African Americans begin to be able to access Social Security and Medicare as time goes by. Don't hold me to what year that becomes possible, but the New Deal begins to do something. The war happens, the veterans come back, and then in that space, these policies of creating home ownership for white people, and of creating, you know, actually these loans created that, and attaching to jobs the winds of the labor market, the labor movement, to be able to, you know, have a 40-hour work week and a pension and all those kinds of things begin to create the white middle class. And the Black population works really hard and presses into middle class status as well, and in great numbers. And there's ups and downs. The deindustrialization that happens in the 80s problematizes that, and sends some of the Black middle class back into working class status. But whatever middle class there is in the United States today, it gets made by those programs, and gets made. So this happens, yet, so it is a huge affirmative action plan for white people, creating initially the white middle class. And this is the legacy that we continue to live. So however you are positioned in this, whatever intersection you're at in your own embodiment in regard to race or ethnicity or native born or immigrant status, whatever that is for you, this is the history, and this is why there's a disparity. This is the initial whys, the underlying whys of why there's a disparity in wealth and social stratification by race in the United States. It's also carried on by the fact that there is a wage gap. There is a female wage gap, and that is also worsened if you're a woman of color. And it's, you know, there's the all women make this much, and Asian American women make this much, and Black women and Latina women, you know, like these levels of earning are all also affected by race, and household income in the United States affected by race. So it also affects our earning capacities, but these are the ways it's affected our home ownership, our land ownership, and our ability to gather wealth as parts of families and leave that wealth to our descendants, and ways in which that's been disrupted across all of American history. So let me close with a thought that if anyone indicates to you that, you know, why don't people just get over it? This was all such a long time ago. And I don't know that anyone is saying that this week, but, you know, that's something that's been commonly said the past half century, is like, you know, why don't Black people just get over it? It's interesting in regard to Jewish people and the Holocaust. It is never forget, and and rightly so. And in regard to African Americans and that which has been robbed from them all across this time, as Trevor Noah put it sometime about a week ago, Black bodies are being looted all of the time in front of us. But, you know, in the space of all that has happened and continues to happen to people in our nation and around the globe, but in our nation in regard to race and ethnicity, it's like, why don't you just get over it? Like, that was so long ago. Like, slavery was like so long ago. And, you know, and then it's like, yeah, but segregation went on until, you know, 100 years later. And it's like, yeah, but that was so long ago now. Like, you know, that was so long ago, Martin Luther King. Like, why is no one over this yet? And the fact is that not only is it ongoing, as we can see in the deaths that have happened on cell phone camera footage over the past decade, but it's also, there's a legacy when you gather wealth. Whatever stuff you've amassed right now, it goes to someone someday, right? When my father died, he had buckets of crayons and old encyclopedias from the 60s, and he had things we all had to get rid of and sell and keep, and land and a house. And there's a story I won't go into about the land. I didn't benefit. But anyway, so I was supposed to, and he meant for me to. Sorry about my head there. And he meant for me to. So be well. I hope you're enjoying the work of learning social stratification and from a sociological perspective. And we do need to change this. It is time to make a difference. Be the change you want to see in the world.